Addiction is not about substances. It's not about alcohol, heroin, porn, food, or even your phone. According to Carl Jung, addiction is the modern man's substitute for genuine spiritual experience. What we call addiction, Jung called possession. Something takes over you, an unconscious force, a psychic complex, and you become its slave. You feel the craving rising. You know it will destroy you, but you give in anyway. Why? Because you're not fighting a habit. You're fighting a shadow. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The addict believes they lack willpower, but what they really lack is integration. The addict is not weak. The addict is split. One part of the self wants to heal, while another part, the wounded child, the abandoned soul, the inner darkness, wants to escape. And addiction offers the fastest escape there is. But here's the truth Jung understood. Every addiction hides a deeper pain, a trauma buried so deep that even words cannot reach it. The drug isn't the problem. The drug is the answer to a question you haven't dared to ask. That's why no amount of discipline can truly heal addiction. Because you're not dealing with logic. You're dealing with a psychic wound. You're dealing with the absence of meaning, the lack of wholeness, the cry of the soul for transformation. Jung wrote that all neurosis is an attempt at self-cure. Addiction is your psyche's desperate attempt to find unity, to numb the unbearable fragmentation inside you. The path to healing, then, is not through suppression, it's through integration. The addict must become whole, not by fighting the darkness, but by learning to understand it. You must ask, what is this addiction trying to protect me from? What am I not willing to feel? What part of myself have I exiled? Until you confront the demon within, you will keep trying to numb its voice. But if you have the courage to face it, to listen, to see what it really wants, you'll realize something shocking. The demon isn't trying to destroy you, it's trying to wake you up. Every addiction begins with a wound, not always dramatic, not always visible, but deep. A wound of neglect, of disconnection, of being unseen. Jung believed that what we fail to process consciously becomes lodged in the unconscious, and there it grows into a complex, an emotional splinter with a life of its own. For the addict, that splinter becomes unbearable, and the addiction becomes the anesthetic. You're not chasing pleasure, you're escaping pain, the pain of not being held, the pain of being misunderstood, the pain of growing up in a world that demanded performance but offered no safety. Somewhere along the way, you learned that your feelings were too much, that your sadness was inconvenient, that your anger was dangerous. So you buried it, and like all things buried, it started to rot. Jung said, we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness is your repressed emotion, your ungrieved grief, your unscreamed rage. It didn't disappear, it went underground. And now, it speaks through the craving, the drug, the drink, the screen. They're just translators. Your addiction is speaking the language of your pain. But what would happen if you listened to the original voice? What if instead of numbing, you began to feel? That's where the healing starts, not with willpower, but with honesty. Radical honesty. You sit with the discomfort. You look at the shame. You ask the question, where did this pain begin? You stop running. You stop blaming. And slowly, painfully, you begin to remember. Jung often emphasized the importance of returning to the source. The wound holds the key. The addiction is not the enemy. It's a messenger. It carries the map to the part of yourself that was left behind. To overcome addiction, you must become a detective of your own soul. You must trace the shape of your suffering and see whose voice lives inside it. Is it your mother's silence? Your father's anger? Society's rejection? Your own self-hatred? Until you name it, it owns you. But the moment you bring it into awareness, the healing begins. The wound demands a voice. Give it one, not through destruction, but through compassion. Because the part of you that is addicted is not evil. It is simply the part that has been alone the longest. Carl Jung believed that every human being carries within them a shadow, the unconscious parts of ourselves that we deny, repress, and refuse to face. For the addict, the shadow becomes unbearably loud. It is not just a part of you. It is the part you are terrified to admit exists. This is the part that rages, that grieves, that longs. It's the you that never got to cry when your heart broke. It's the you that was told to toughen up when you felt afraid. It's the you that had to laugh when you wanted to scream. And because this shadow was never welcomed, it began to act out. It sought relief. It whispered in the night. It craved numbness. It learned to hide behind the high, the drink, the scroll, the binge. But here's the truth. What you don't face controls you. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Addiction is not fate. It is a pattern born from pain, maintained by avoidance and fed by the shadow. You're not weak, you're fragmented, you're not broken, you're buried. And that shadow, the part of you that you fear the most, isn't trying to destroy you. It's trying to be heard. Think about it. Every time you try to quit, something pulls you back. That something is not your enemy. It's your story, unwritten, unloved, unresolved. Shadow is hungry because it was never fed with love. You tried to silence it with dopamine, but it craved attention, not sedation. You tried to kill it with shame, but it needed compassion. You tried to outrun it, but it is you. The path to healing is not about defeating the shadow. It's about turning toward it and saying, "I see you." It's about sitting with the part of you that feels unworthy and letting it speak. Not to justify the behavior, but to understand the wound beneath it. Every relapse is a message. Every craving is a call. The addiction is not asking for more substances, it's asking for more self. Not the perfect self, the real self. The raw, the tender, the human. To overcome addiction is not to win a battle. It is to make peace with your shadow. Because only then can the hunger finally rest. Most people think addiction is about pleasure, about chasing highs, thrill, escape. But Carl Jung saw something much deeper. Addiction is often the language of a soul in pain, speaking through the body when words were never allowed. Beneath every compulsive behavior is a wound that began in silence. Maybe no one ever asked you how you felt. Maybe you were punished for crying, mocked for feeling, or ignored when you needed comfort. Slowly, you learned that emotions weren't safe. That vulnerability meant danger. And so, you found a substitute. A bottle, a screen, a pill, a person. Something that didn't judge you. Something that could hold you, even if just for a moment. Something that didn't need you to explain why you hurt, because you couldn't explain it anyway. You didn't have the words. The pain was too old, too vague, too buried. Jung understood this as the split between the conscious and unconscious mind. The ego tells us we're fine, in control, functional. But underneath, the unconscious remembers. It remembers every time you were abandoned. It remembers the tone in their voice when you disappointed them. It remembers the day you gave up asking for love. That's the part that becomes the addiction. The unspoken grief, the frozen child, the ache with no name. So what does healing look like? It begins when we stop moralizing the addiction and start listening to it. Not in a way that gives it power, but in a way that gives it meaning. Ask yourself, what is this addiction protecting me from? What feeling does it numb? What memory does it bury? The goal isn't to hate yourself for relapsing, it's to get curious about what triggered it. The substance is not the enemy, it's the messenger. The pain behind it is what needs your attention. Jung believed that healing came not from eliminating suffering, but by finding meaning in it. That means revisiting the wounds, not to get stuck in them, but to free the part of you still trapped there. It means allowing yourself to grieve the childhood you never got, the love you never received, the safety you never felt. And this, grieving is not weakness, it is the beginning of integration. The wound will not kill you, denying it will. But if you give it words, if you give it air, it will finally begin to breathe. And so will you. Carl Jung warned that what we deny within ourselves does not disappear. It gathers strength in the darkness. He called it the shadow, the repressed, hidden part of our psyche that holds all the things we don't want to see. Every addiction has a shadow, and the more we try to fight it with willpower alone, the more it controls us from the unconscious. Because addiction is not just about dopamine or chemicals, it's about exile. A part of you was rejected by others and eventually by yourself. Maybe it was your anger, your neediness, your hunger to be held. Maybe it was your fear, your shame, your sexuality. But instead of being met with understanding, these emotions were punished or ignored. So you buried them. You became who the world wanted you to be, and you cast the rest into the shadow. But the shadow does not vanish. It returns through your cravings, your compulsions, your addictions. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The craving is not random. It is the shadow knocking. It is the unloved part of you asking to be seen. That's why discipline alone isn't enough. That's why even after 30 days clean, the monster returns. Because you haven't met the part of yourself you're running from. You've tried to kill it. But Jung tells us the path to healing is not war, it's integration. You must turn toward the shadow, not to indulge it, but to understand it. Ask, what am I afraid to feel? What part of me have I locked away? What pain have I disowned? The moment you stop running is the moment the addiction loses its grip. It no longer needs to scream for your attention, because now you're listening. You're seeing the wound, not as your identity, but as your teacher. And when you face the shadow, something strange happens. It becomes your strength. The rejected child becomes your compassion. The anger becomes your boundary. The fear becomes your honesty. This is the beginning of wholeness, not perfection, not purity, but truth. To be whole means to hold both the light and the shadow in your hands, not to judge them, but to understand that healing is not about being good. It's about being real. And only what is real can be free. We live in a culture that worships control. You're told to be strong, to be disciplined, to just say no. And so when you're trapped in addiction, the natural response is to fight it. Tighten your grip, clench your fists, and try to overpower it with will. But this is the first illusion. Because the more you try to dominate the addiction through force, the more it owns you in secret. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He knew that addiction was not something to be conquered in the traditional sense. He saw that the root of addiction was not weakness, but disconnection from the self, from meaning, from spirit. Willpower might silence the symptom, but it cannot heal the wound. In fact, it often deepens it. Why? Because the constant effort to control turns into repression, and repression always leads to a return of the repressed. You might quit for a while, but if the pain underneath still festers, the craving will find a way back, through another substance, a relationship, a compulsive behavior. The answer, Jung said, lies not in domination, but in surrender. Not surrender to the addiction, but surrender to the truth, to the realization that you cannot heal yourself with the same fragmented mind that created the wound. This is not failure. It's humility. It's the doorway to transformation. Real change begins when you stop pretending you have full control and instead open yourself to something deeper. Jung believed in the power of the self, the higher organizing principle of the psyche that moves us toward wholeness. To surrender is to trust that deeper force, to allow the psyche to bring what is broken back into harmony. But this requires honesty, radical honesty. Not just I'm addicted, but I'm in pain. I'm lost. I'm scared. I don't know who I am without this. And in that moment of truth, something ancient awakens. A flicker of presence that is not your addiction and not your ego. It is the beginning of the real you. From here, healing is no longer a battle. It becomes a reconciliation. You stop trying to destroy the addict inside you, and you begin listening to its message. You begin walking the path of integration. And that is when the grip loosens. Not because you forced it, but because you finally understood what it was trying to say all along. There's a secret no one tells you when you're drowning in addiction. The part of you that suffers the most may also carry the greatest gift. Carl Jung believed that the figure of the addict closely resembles the archetype of the wounded healer. Someone who is called to transformation through suffering, someone whose deepest pain hides their deepest potential. But to reach it, you must stop seeing yourself as broken. You are not just a person with a problem. You are a soul with a calling. Addiction is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of a deeper one. The compulsion that destroyed you is the same energy that can resurrect you once it is purified and understood. But this requires a shift in perception. You must begin to look at your suffering not as a curse, but as a clue. The addict is not weak. They are sensitive. They feel more. They carry more. Their pain is louder because their soul is trying harder to be heard. Jung saw this. He saw that the addict's craving was often a distorted expression of a spiritual hunger. A hunger for connection, for truth, for unity with something greater than the ego. And when that longing is denied or misunderstood, it twists into obsession, into escape, into cycles of destruction. But when it is honored, when it is brought into consciousness and integrated, the same addict can become a force of healing, not just for themselves, but for others. That is the journey of the wounded healer. They enter the darkness, not by choice, but by fate. And if they survive, if they face themselves fully and extract meaning from their pain, they return with a light that others cannot find. Your addiction does not disqualify you from wholeness. It qualifies you to lead others through it. Because you know the terrain. You've walked through hell. And if you're willing to learn from it, you carry a medicine no book can teach. This is not a path for the faint-hearted. It is for those who are willing to transform rather than numb, to feel instead of flee, to stand in the fire and ask, what is this here to teach me? If you answer that question honestly, you will begin to see what Jung saw, that beneath the ashes of your lowest moment lies the seed of your highest purpose. The most dangerous illusion in recovery is the belief that healing means becoming pure, clean, or morally superior. This is not Jung's view. Jung knew that any true transformation must confront the shadow, the hidden, denied, and often shameful parts of the psyche. And for the addict, this is where the real work begins. It is easy to